Let's bow our heads. Father, thanks for the rain. The area has needed it quite some time, and we're fortunate got a couple days worth. Thanks for the sunshine and the fall flowers and the turning leaves. May we always be mindful of your creation. Thank you for Thanksgiving and the ability to gather around the table with friends and relatives. And we thank you for our class, those who are here and those who are not this morning, that we're able to fellowship and to learn more about you. In thy name we pray. Amen. Well, we're going to finish up the last of the social principles today. And I personally think that these last two, this the political community, and I've kind of combined it with the last one, which is the world community, are perhaps critically important. And why do I say that? Well, because no matter what specific section, whether it be nurturing or social or economic, no matter what the issue is, the solution likely lies with a policy or law. Things that our government and the international community might have to take or could take or have the responsibility for taking action to solve some of the issues that we've talked about. And of course, the individual, we around this table, and our church assume responsibility for assisting or accomplishing many of the tasks required to correct the social injustices or the issues that we've talked about over the last several weeks. Some of those issues like immigration, abortion, education, poverty, the rights of individuals, HIV and AIDS, the family, human sexuality, climate change, and the list is pretty long. Today's list looks a little bit like this. The church responds to these issues by creating programs that address human shortfalls and governmental shortfalls, for that matter, in response to disasters like MCOR, Methodist Council on Relief, and funds these through contributions. Individuals and churches can use their influence. There was a time, I think, when those in the church felt that it was not appropriate to influence the government on issues and seek government assistance and programs. But that's changed, and in fact, in my opinion, you'll hear some of my opinions today, unfortunately. I think the reach has been on the opposite end, that there are too many individual organizations that espouse Christian thoughts and ideas that perhaps have gone beyond what I would reasonably expect church organizations to do. One of the ways we take care of these issues is by voting. And we vote for representatives who support the positions that we have, and many of them, I hope, are part of the social principles that we've been talking about. Other ways that we can influence these issues is by the careers that we've chosen. You could be a teacher, you could be a fireman, you could be a policeman, you could be in the military, whose primary task, if you think about it, like Steve here, who's a fireman, Harold and I have been in the military, Dale, right? Some of you may have been teachers, and other positions where your principal responsibility is society in general, which is, I think, commendable. So what does the Bible say about political and world communities? It has a little bit to say. Paul tells us in Romans that God has established governments, and as Christians, we are to submit to the ruling authorities. Now, in some ways, that seems kind of hard. If you think about Christ's time, Rome was in charge, and this was in Paul's day, and he told the Christians at the time that they were to bend to Roman authority. And let's go look at that. Romans 13, first 7 verses. So Rome was a hated conqueror, but yet Paul is telling his listeners, his readers, that they were to abide by Roman authority. Careful, Marianne, don't trip. Romans 13. Everyone must submit himself to the governing authorities, and there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, he who rebels against authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right, and he will commend you. For he is God's servant to do you good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword for nothing. He is God's servant, an agent of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoers. Therefore, it is necessary to submit to authorities, not only because of the possible punishment, but also because of the signs, because of conscience. Even talks about paying taxes, right? Now that can be pretty harsh if you think about what Paul is saying. Now, one of the reasons why he said it back then was he didn't want Christians to be accused of being rabble-rousers or being against things. He didn't want the authorities to come down on the church because he wanted the church to grow. So there were some personal reasons why he said those things in his time, but I think it's appropriate today also that not only do we accept government as put in place by our God, but it also means that we have responsibilities relevant to the government, and the principal one, I think, is to not only abide by the laws, but also to vote to make sure the government adequately represents you. Now, this seems okay for us in our society, but if you belong to a dictator, if you're a Russian citizen right now, that might be a little harsh. But it is what it is. Paul wasn't the only one. Isaiah in the Old Testament, also under threat of authorities like Assyria and Babylon, had some things to say about the country and its citizens. He kind of echoed Amos, who came later. We talked about Amos last week, who was in some ways one of the minor prophets who spoke out strongly against injustices from the government and religious leaders. So let's go to Isaiah chapter 61. And I'll read the first couple verses to get us oriented in, skip to verse 7 and 8. So Isaiah chapter 61.
Sorry, Isaiah what?
61. Isaiah says, starting verse 1, the Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me because the Lord has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives and release from darkness for the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn. And then shift over verse 7. Instead of their shame, my people will receive a double portion, and instead of disgrace, they will rejoice in their inheritance, and so they will inherit a double portion in their land, and everlasting joy will be theirs. For I, the Lord, love justice. I hate robbery and iniquity. In my faithfulness, I will reward them and make an everlasting covenant with them. So he's looking for justice in the land. And as I said, he lived through the Assyrian conquest and then later on the Babylonian conquest. So here's what I find disturbing in today's society is that our politicians, instead of finding and acting on issues important to our society, tend to pick on things that or enact laws for their own political personal gain. So I unlike other times, I've tried to refrain from expressing some personal opinions, but I'm going to do that a little bit this morning because it bothers me a lot. Let me give you some examples. Book burnings are up 38% since 2022, mostly under the pretext of protecting children. There are existing policies right now. I'm sure if you went to the library, they have policies on, they can create a list of restricted books.
They can.
Yeah.
Ashley's library, they can do that.
Yeah. As parents, we can take issue and bring those things to the school board. But only recently, I think, has this been politicized to be much more extensive than what we've had in the past. Certainly, abortion is undergoing political upheaval because of the, Supreme Court's recent edict against a 50-year previous precedent. Interesting statistics: there were more abortions performed last year than there were in any previous year.
Excuse me, that's also like when you say the book banning, if you tell a kid don't read this,
They're gonna read it.
they're gonna check it out tomorrow.
Yeah, and what's interesting,
Unless they have a video game.
and what's interesting, there's as much sexual violence in our Bible as there are in other areas. I mean, all you have to do is read the story about Diana, the sister of the 12 tribes. That's pretty
I
gruesome.
must have missed that.
You'll never forget it once you read it, trust me.
Anti-LGBTQ and transgender laws have been enacted by state and local governments, again under the pretext of protecting children. Our own Virginia Beach school system recently adopted Virginia's governor's controversial rules governing transgender school policies. North Carolina has just enacted new restrictions. The state of Florida recently passed a slew of laws actually, governing what can be taught about race relations in schools from elementary to college. Effectively, from what I read now, that colleges in the state of Florida have pretty much restricted in what they can say. So they don't have freedom of instruction anymore. Professors have to watch.
And Robert, when I taught, and I advertised 23 years ago, I started teaching, if they didn't want to read, say, the Scarlet Letter or To Kill a Mockingbird, we had books to offer them, with the parents said, I don't want to read them.
Right.
So what's happening is, especially the book bannings, most of these people, and they'll tell you, they haven't even read the book. They read a little part, I don't like this, therefore the book's bad. I had no idea. But I'm sorry,
Right. Recently, one of the school instruction outlines that had to do with slavery, one of the conclusions was that slavery wasn't all that bad because it taught slaves a useful skill for when they became free. There are laws restricting critical race theory. That's never been taught in high school or elementary school throughout the United States. All done, I think, for political gain, but also under the pretext of keeping the learner from feeling anguish and guilty. When you were in school, do you remember when you talked about slavery? Did you feel guilty or anguish? Or if you did at the time, has that affected you today as a person? Some of the justifications are really far-fetched. Our social principles hold governments responsible for protecting the rights of individuals to fair elections, freedom of speech and religion, assembly, communicating without fear of reprisal. It doesn't matter which side of the issue you stand on. The current political ideologies in the U.S. today are far and away, I think, off the mark and meeting our social principle standards. Not only that, but standing up for some of these issues also creates life-threatening situations for doctors and judges and lawyers, governors, congressmen, and their families. It's really pitiful, I think, in my own personal opinion, that we have arrived at that sort of environment. So right now I want to look more closely at some of the specific political issues and what our social principles in this area have to say. The United Methodist Church supports the separation of church and state, no prayer or worship in schools, but students can practice their own religious convictions. Now, some of you may have experienced prayer in school, and I know a lot of Christians say, why can't we do that? I have a daughter-in-law who's a teacher in school, and she says, if you're allowed, she says, I don't want to have Christian prayers in school, because if I have Christian prayers in school, then I have to have Muslim prayers in school, I have to have atheist prayers in school, and it's just better that it stay out of the school system.
And they've been battling that for decades. We were not allowed to wear a cross if it was too big, and you had to have it under your shirt. You were not allowed to have a Bible on your desk because that was offensive. So when you can't teach some of these things without it. They knew if we reached something. I had it at my desk. Mrs. Brooks, can I look at? Can I see your Bible? And I said, yep. Just put it back in the drawer. So this is a dumb game, but again, it was that kind of.
Yeah. Citizens, our social principles say citizens should have access to all essential information regarding the government. This goes to freedom of information. Citizens have the right to peacefully dissent from laws they consider unjust. So if you're a conscientious objector or you're want to march against abortion, the social principles of the United Methodist Church say you have a right to do that, and you should do that. They also say that you have to accept the results of your disobedience. In other words, people in legal jeopardy must be, you could go to jail. Let's put it that way. But at the same time, if you go to jail for social principles, then you have a right, you have certain individual civil rights if you're in jail. The church opposes the death penalty and urges its elimination in all legal codes. Let me ask you a question. In the criminal justice system, what's the difference between a restorative justice system and a retributive justice system? Anybody know?
Is when you go after, okay, you did this and this is the punishment. Restorative is something about having to make it better. In other words, make the person better, not the situation.
Almost,
Okay.
Not quite. Retributive uses punishment as an equalizing tool for accountability of an offender to the state. That's the kind of system we have in the state of Virginia. A restorative system holds the offender accountable to the person who was affected or the victim. In other words, essentially you get the perpetrator in a room together with the victim and they decide what's appropriate. Interestingly enough, Canada, England, Scotland, Australia, New Zealand, Norway, Japan, and 32 states have restorative systems. Now, the reason I mention that is because the social principles proposes and endorses restorative system as opposed to retributive. retributive systems. Everybody understand?
Understood.
No retribution, they made it into, yeah, but yeah.
Okay. The social principles for military service are against war and against the draft. The church is to support conscientious objectors who refuse to serve in the armed forces. A pastor in a Methodist church should encourage or provide encouragement to any young man or women in a draft to prevent them from going into the service. Did you know that? Some issues from the world community. Certainly, we talked about globalization last week, and that makes the world much more united. Not united in ideas, but meaning the actions of one state or nation can affect another or multiple other states. Nations and cultures are affirmed by God, and the church believes that nations are responsible for fair treatment of their citizens. War is rejected as an instrument of national foreign policy. Social principles endorses complete disarmament and stopping the production and possession of nuclear weapons. And lastly, the social principles endorses the United Nations, the International Court of Justice, and the International Criminal Court as instruments to achieve a world of justice and law. So your social principles are attuned to what's happening in the world. Now, I'd like to discuss some of the issues and some of the things that I've come across over the last several weeks. And these topics, they're political in nature, but they could involve any of the social principles that we've talked about today. The first one is North Carolina. North Carolina just passed a law over Governor Cooper's veto that bars medical professionals from providing hormone therapy, puberty blocking drugs, and surgical gender transition procedures to anyone under the age of 18. Now, if you read this in the paper, other than your personal opinion, what considerations would you have relative to the social principles that we've just talked about? So if you were voting in North Carolina for a legislator and you wanted to know what his position was on this sort of law, what are some things that you could draw on?
Personal experiences, like if you know someone was murdered, maybe?
Yeah, okay. So here, if you go back to nurturing, the nurturing community, it says family is the basic human community in which persons are to be sustained. So if you went on that, you would say, well, it's really a family decision. It's not a government decision. Family violence and abuse is detrimental. In the social area, the rights of children. Children have rights to health care, as do adults, but also must be protected against sexual abuse and exploitation. The rights of youth. Encourage youth in decision-making process. Equal rights with respect to sexual orientation. Social principles say you have equal protection under the law. The right to health care. It's unjust to construct barriers to physical or mental wholeness. And under the political area, basic freedoms, the right to privacy, education, and health care. So there's a lot that you would have to consider if this was an issue. Here's another one. Texas legislatures are attempting to pass a bill that would require the 10 Commandments to be displayed prominently in every classroom, and also to hire religious chaplains in place of guidance counselors. So if you were a Texas citizen in the United Methodist Church, what support or opposition would you provide from the social principles? Well, under political, church and state cannot use its authority to promote particular religious beliefs, nor prayer or worship, but cannot mean abolition of religious expression from public life. So you see, there are so many of these kind of in-between areas. What's the harm of putting the Ten Commandments up? There was a legislature or a governor in one of the states that prominently displayed it, even kept it out after he was after the court told him to take
Was
it
it
down.
Southern State? What was it?
South
I
Carolina?
think it was Mississippi. It was one of those two.
Yeah, it was either South Carolina or Mississippi, I remember, yeah.
Well, here's another example. Closer to home, Suffolk School Board chair refused to allow a woman to pray during her public comments at an August meeting. In other words, every citizen can go to a board meeting and stand up, and they have 3 minutes. Well, in her 3 minutes, she wanted to pray, and the chairman of the board said she can't do that and had her escorted out. Later on, that was reversed, and they said that they could. Under church and state, political state, the state can't control the church, and the church can't control the state. There's to be no organic union of church and state, but there can be interaction. The First Amendment says Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of a religion. So the courts have said no school prayer. Legislation prayer is okay, and legislatures can hire chaplains. School board prayers, no. I guess if a schoolboards often used to start their meetings with a prayer, and even if they would invite other pastors or other people from around the community to off that was taken to court, and that's no longer an option for school boards. And that's why the president of the Suffolk School Board said she couldn't do it. But later on, it was the legal folks said in that context it was okay. Here's another one. Chesapeake Western Branch High School had a concert, I suppose for the holidays, and they had a couple religious songs in the concert, and one of the folks who attended, parents, brought action against the school because they were promoting religion. Again, there's a lot of gray area in that, and I think what's remarkable is that we have a lot of good Christians who are now voicing their concerns about things that in the past have not been voiced. And I think that's principally because there are organizations throughout the country who are promoting those sorts of things. And so it's a political action committee essentially that's prompting all of these controversies. In the past, it's been pretty much just an individual or a family or somebody that's raised some objections, and generally it's been taken care of. But nowadays, it's the threat of lawsuits and things like that really kind of bother me. Here's an interesting one. This has to do with the capital punishment. Alabama, Oklahoma, and Mississippi just authorized nitrogen hypoxia as an approved execution method. Anybody know what that is?
Is that like the deep dye disease?
No, they actually put a mask on a prisoner, and he breathes pure nitrogen, and eventually their heart will stop because they're not getting any oxygen. So, what's the status of capital punishment in the state of Virginia? Do we have capital punishment here? No, we don't. Virginia is the 23rd state to abolish the death penalty and did so in July of 2021. It was the first state in the South to abolish capital punishment. And of course, our social principles is against capital punishment. So if you were United Methodists in the state of Texas or in the state of Virginia, where would you stand? Obviously, in the state of Virginia, you would agree with that political result. In the state of Texas, you would be opposed to that, right? Which states have the most death row inmates?
I was gonna say Texas, Mississippi, do you think? Is there some other, do you know?
According to Ron White, they're putting in an express lane in Texas, so that might not be a very long way there.
California, Florida, Texas, Alabama, total of 2,557 inmates. The death penalty is currently authorized in 27 states in the United States and the federal government and the military. Military code does have capital punishment. In your opinion, how should our university presidents be responsible, or what should be their response to the recent fighting between Hamas and Israel? We've seen a lot of that on the news, right? What do you think university presidents should be supporting on their campuses? And maybe some of your grandkids
To
who are
me,
on
this should
those
be important
campuses.
some kind of education, because some of this just comes down to stupidity. You only have one narrow, you only know this side of the story.
Should they voice their opinions against the war in general, or take a stand against Hamas in particular? What should be the response of our president? I'm not expecting an answer, but think about it now. If you're United Methodist and you have these social principles and this war that's gone on, whose side do you take? Do you prohibit one side from expressing their others, or do you encourage both sides to express their opinions? Here's a article about says university leaders must favor morality over extremism. Our world community, social principles, rejects war as an instrument of national policy. It opposes first strike strategies for any government, and it's to use the United Nations as a body to broker peace. Political social principles say universities are to ensure academic freedom and an environment allowing free exchange of ideas. An article, this is the article by the CEO of U.S. News, that academia should be speaking out against Hamas because they train our leaders and should condemn brutality and uphold the rule of law. I found this quote interesting. Listen to this. It is time to speak up for our values. The words of German pastor Martin Niemöller come to mind, and I assume this was during World War II. First, they came for communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me. So let me see if I can offer some conclusions. If you're not mixed up, it's typical because you can't read anything in the paper or listen to anything in the news today where all these gray areas. But as I said, I think the difference is that there are so many, and I'll call them political action organizations, that have formulated, and usually they're, I'll probably be wrong, but saying I think they're ultra conservative and mostly from the right, not so much from the left, that espouse some of these Christian principles to the point where it interferes with the rights of individuals to make personal and family decisions, and in my mind they're not motivated by, I can say this because I'm not them. I would say that they probably think they're motivated by Christian principles and Christian beliefs. But what bothers me is that there's always another side, right? Mm-hmm. If you're a right to life person, there is always the mother that you have to think about. If you're for capital punishment, there's always the family that's left behind. If your child has some proclivity toward not normal sexual behavior, then there's a family thing that you don't want to be forced. If you are a doctor who is looking out for the rights of a woman who has a ectopic pregnancy, you have a responsibility to save that person, but they're in legal jeopardy. Perhaps we've had these things in our society before, but this is the first time in my 7 decades of living that I've recognized things I think are a little bit out of kilter. And so I would encourage you to take a look at these social principles and figure out how you can use them in making decisions when you read this. So let me see if I can draw some conclusions. How as United Methodists do we respond to these political issues of today when the political scene is so radicalized on both ends? I don't think we can deny that. First of all, I would say stay connected to the issues. As United Methodist members and U.S. citizens, it's our responsibility to know the facts in any issue. Whether we choose to act or join a movement is really up to us, and the social principles tell us clearly that we have a right to engage in social activity in response to some of these issues. Be careful. Second thing, be careful where you get your information. Social media is not reliable as a factual source, plain and simple.
Amen.
Cable news is usually biased, and therefore their information is frequently inaccurate, not complete, or highly politicized. Cable news networks like Fox and CNN are not good choices, and I picked one on the left and one on the right. Major news channels like NBC, CBS, ABC, and especially PBS, public broadcasting, are, in my opinion, have a more professional and even-handed approach. So if your favorite news channel is Fox News, maybe watch it for entertainment, but don't watch it for facts. You won't find them there, I don't think. As an example, let me ask you a question. In your opinion, are violent crimes in the United States higher or lower today than 30 years ago? How many think they're higher?
I would have said higher, but you've got that graph
But
that's.
Oh, shocked!
I think it's either the same or lower.
Well, if you
don't know.
go-
I didn't want to show this until I'd asked the
Oh, I
question.
didn't look, I'm sorry.
But if you listen to the news,
Every single morning.
you would think that it is a lot higher.
Yeah.
And you know,
So I was going to ask, is it higher than 30 years ago? And is it higher than 2 years ago? Now, 30 years ago, you may have a constructive answer, but if you listen to the news today, you would think that violent crime is higher today than it was 2 years ago. Yeah, unfortunately, I read an article the other day. A young woman from New York was wounded seriously in a high school shooting, and she went to college, and she was involved in the Michigan State shooting that was on up there. She didn't get shot, but she was hiding out in the classroom when it happened. How remarkable would that have been 20 years ago, but not so much today. Anyhow, you can see from this chart, this is murders, not violent crime, but violent crime pretty much follows the same scenario. It's way down from 30 years ago, and it's down from 2 years ago. But if you listen to the news, that's not what you hear, right? Because you're hearing things on the end of the political spectrum.
And if you read the newspaper, because I started as a journalism major, how far along does the average person read the newspaper?
I'd say first or third.
That's where they put all the most important facts and the most inflammatory things, because they know the majority of people are not going to read to the end of that article.
And I
Same way
need
with the
to
news.
Right,
recap
exactly,
on
right.
Ithaca. On
Yeah.
Ithaca, I know because number one, it was on the news, but number two, I'd ride around with my bro in his little popo car, and it was coming across this police radio about the shootings in Ithaca. So I know that's on a news channel. I was hearing it live. So
What I read an interesting editorial a couple weeks ago, and it said, we force people to have licenses and go through testing before we put them behind the wheel of a car.
Mhm.
But you don't have to follow similar criteria to have a gun.
Yeah.
Okay. So anyhow, that was just an example of the kinds of things that you're hearing nowadays, and anything probably in the social principles, any of the issues that we're talking about, whether it's immigration, whether it's abortion, it will just be radicalized on both ends. And so please be careful where you get your facts and information. Thirdly, one doesn't have to take a stand on every social issue. So I've talked about that, but you don't have to go look into social principles and say, okay, where do I stand on each and everything? That's not necessarily the way to handle the social principles. I think that if you come across something that somebody said, or you end up being in a conversation where the issue comes up, or you read something, you may want to use your social principles and go back and see what the church's stand is. Now remember, the social principles are not church law, right? There are things in the social principles that I don't agree with. That doesn't make me a bad Christian, doesn't make me a good Christian. It's just, it's an expression of church faith, and it's voted on by all the church members at the church conference, which, by the way, is going to happen in May of next year. So having had this series of lessons, you might be interested in hearing or watching some of the deliberations that go on, and they're going to be local, right? Dale, where they're at? They're Charlotte, North Carolina.
Do you know when?
April, I think April 29th, 28th, something like that. I can look it up.
Yeah, it's about a week. Marianne?
One other concern that was brought to light this week by a series of newscasts from public radio is that none of these issues are simple. And we tend to take bullet points and try to make them simple because they're just so overwhelming. The particular story that I'm referencing was how these right to life laws, and I'm misspeaking probably in naming them such, but how they have affected more radically the poor and those that are located in certain geographic areas that have greater distance from medical care that would be allowed in a nearby state. So where someone in Texas needed to travel all the way to Kansas to get help, another person might travel 2 miles across the Ohio and Mississippi River, whatever, St. Louis and Southern Illinois meet there and to get care.
23rd
So-
of April
Thank you.
through the
It's
4th of May.
easy to respond to a simple, but we have to be aware it's far more complicated than we ever
Yes.
imagined.
And in case people who are watching the video couldn't hear everything, Mary Ann said that every situation is more complicated and there are more nuances than you can shake a stick at, and which is even more important why we should seek out facts and not just necessarily the bullet points. Another one having to do with the right to life is, when all the political commentary about not having abortion, there was never any words that I heard that talked about support for the woman in terms of child care, raising all the reasons why a woman may decide not to have a child. How do you support that woman if she has to have a child? And despite the fact that there's all this concern about the child, I didn't see an equal concern about the woman. And every case, as Mary Ann said, is really complicated. And even though I may have simplified, made things simple, they are not. They are not.
It even creates discord in families. Dan and I butt heads and still butt heads because he wants to carry a concealed weapon, but he understands it doesn't come in my house.
Right.
But we had a close friend who was murdered, so there's a part of me that thinks.
Right.
So I think when you get into families too, you understand it's not always, it gets muddied.
Right. And the last suggestion I would have for you, please vote. This last session, we had every Virginia legislature on the docket. The last, if I recall correctly, one of the recent votes, we actually had a tie, and the decision was made by a flip of a coin. So if you think your vote doesn't count in today's elections, all the elections are close nowadays because pretty much all the representation has been almost decided in advance, and there are a few contested areas. But please, please, please vote. Pick the topics that you're interested in, and investigate the individuals. I grant you sometimes it's hard to find out what the person stands for, but our local paper usually does a pretty good job of asking our local representatives questions and having them respond to them and see if they fit what you think are important. And if you have any questions, use your social principles.
I'm going to share a post I read this morning. It said, I was abused as a child. My parents spanked me. And today I have the problem of being respectful to other people. How much, and maybe it relates to them, but how much of this problem exists because we've lost control of our families, lost
And I think that,
discipline and training within the family.
yeah, and that was one of the first things we talked about, right? The
Yeah.
family, the United Methodist Church considers the family to be the
Yeah.
most important organizational structure for a democratic and well-meaning society. So I'll get off my soapbox.
No, I'm glad you said it.
I'll get off my soapbox, and next Sunday we'll
Like that hit and run.
and we'll start some interesting Bible lessons on the backstory of Christmas. What do we need to know about Christmas before Christmas ever took place that makes Christmas an important part of our faith. And hopefully I can get you to think a little bit deeper about the Advent season. Let's bow our heads. Our Father God, we thank you for the country that we live in. We thank you for our church. May we engage as citizens within our government and within the world to have our voices heard and our opinions noted, and certainly to help serve as examples and disciples of Jesus Christ. Be with us now as we go about our business and bring us back safely next Sunday. In thy name we pray. Amen.
Amen.